Everyone praised my sister for taking care of Mama. Nobody saw what I did at night. Clear throat. And my own mother's repast, standing in the fellowship hall of Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church with a paper plate of macaroni and dressing going cold in my hand. I listened to Deacon Arthur Lummis tell my sister Patricia that the Lord doesn't forget a faithful daughter. He held both her hands in his and bowed his head like he was about to anoint her right there next to the sweet tea. People were lined up behind him to do the same thing. Sister Mavis from the choir, Miss Ernestine from 2 doors down on our old street. I stood off to the side with my plate, and not one person in that line turned to find me next. I didn't understand any of it that afternoon. Not really, not even the part of it happening to me while it was happening. It would take me years to put it together. A little at a time, the way you only recognize the shape of a true thing long after you already lived through every piece of it, the kind of thing a whole family, a whole church full of people who genuinely love my mother can get wrong without a single one of them ever meaning to. There's a hymn I think about more than I used to now, one I didn't know I still remembered all the words to until the year all of this happened. I didn't know it yet, standing there with that plate going cold. But I'd be circling back to that hymn for a long time after. For now, what none of us knew yet, standing in that fellowship hall, picking over plates of macaroni and dressing, was that somewhere in a hall closet back at my own house, the one Mama had come to live in those last 6 years, she had already left something behind. Something that would eventually turn everything any of us believed about that day on its head. I just want you to know it was there. The same way so much else was there that none of us could see yet. None of us would lay hands on it for the better part of a year. I didn't know it was there. Patricia didn't know it was there. But it was sitting quiet behind a box of old church programs, waiting the way only a mother can wait, patient enough to let an entire family finish grieving wrong before she finally got the chance to say otherwise. And when what she left behind finally did come out into the light, the person it would shake hardest wouldn't be me. It would be Patricia. We grew up in Titusville, in a house my daddy bought in 1971 with money he saved up working the line at the pipe shop. Back when a Black man with a steady union job could put a down payment on a house in a neighborhood full of teachers and postal workers and a few doctors, and everybody's children played together in the same 3 or 4 backyards and went to the same schools and got baptized in the same church on the same Sundays, sometimes literally the same Sunday, 2 or 3 families at once. White robes hung up to dry on the same clothesline after. My name is Lorraine Mitchell, and to understand how something like this happens to a family, you have to understand Birmingham first, and you have to understand what Mount Olive was to us, going back further than that funeral, further than those notebooks, back to before any of us had any reason to know my mother was sick at all. Mount Olive wasn't just where we went on Sunday mornings. It was where I got my first paying job, 12 years old, helping Sister Mavis set up the folding chairs in the fellowship hall for Wednesday Bible study, 50 cents a session. It was where my parents got married in 1968, where Patricia and Marcus and I all got dedicated as babies, where I had my first kiss behind the Annex building, age 15, with a boy named Curtis Boyd, whose mother still calls my mother's old phone number sometimes out of habit, forgetting. The thing about a church like Mount Olive in a neighborhood like Titusville is that it isn't really separate from the neighborhood at all. It's threaded through it. Deacon Lummis coached Little League at George Ward Park in the summers and ran the men's prayer breakfast at the church on the 3rd Saturday of every month. And those were not 2 different parts of his life. They were the same parts. Because everybody who played on those teams went to one of 3 churches within walking distance of the park, and most of them went to Mount Olive. Miss Ernestine, who lived 2 houses down from us my whole childhood, was also the woman who taught the 4- and 5-year-olds in Sunday school. The same woman who showed up at our door with a casserole the week Daddy died. The same woman who, 40 years before that, had been my mother's bridesmaid. When somebody got sick in Titusville, the church knew before the hospital did. There was a prayer chain, an actual physical list of phone numbers that Sister Mavis kept updated in a spiral notebook. And if your name went on that list, by Tuesday evening, 40 people had called your house to ask what they could bring. The chain worked in a particular order. Sister Mavis, the 5 women, each of those 5 to 5 more, and so on, so that by the time the message reached the last person on the list, it had usually picked up a few extra details along the way, a little embellished, a little smoothed over, the way any story does when 40 mouths pass it along instead of one. Nobody meant any harm by that. It was just how news means to a community that size, the same way water finds the same path down the hill every time it rains. I tell you all this not because it's quaint, though I suppose to somebody who didn't grow up in it, it might sound that way. I tell you because it's the reason what happened to me was even possible. A community that close, that long-standing, builds up a kind of collective memory about families. People don't just know facts about you, they remember you. But that kind of memory only holds on to what it actually witnessed, and I'm about to tell you what it witnessed and what it didn't. Patricia is 4 years older than me. Growing up, she was the one who got the solos in the Easter program, the one Mama would dress up and parade through the fellowship hall after service, introducing her to the older ladies like she was presenting evidence of something. I don't say that with any cruelty toward Patricia, or at least I'm trying not to. She really could sing. She really was and is a beautiful woman. The kind who walks into a room and the room rearranges itself slightly around her without anybody deciding to do that. I was the quiet one. I made good grades and nobody mentioned them at church. I was a deacon's assistant for 2 years running flowers and programs, and not one person outside my own household seemed to register that I existed in any specific way until I did something wrong. Our brother Marcus is between us in age, and he moved to Mobile for shipyard work in his 20s and has mostly stayed there, visiting twice a year, at Christmas and sometimes in the summer for the family reunion. I want to be fair to Marcus. He wasn't around for most of what I'm about to tell you, and distance does something to a person's understanding of a situation that isn't quite his fault, even if it isn't quite innocent either. Mama started having trouble with her heart the year I turned 40. Congestive heart failure, the doctors at UAB called it, on top of diabetes she had since her 50s that she'd never managed especially well, because managing it especially well would have meant slowing down, and Odessa Pruitt did not believe in slowing down for anybody, including her own body. The first hospitalization scared all of us. I remember sitting in a waiting room on the 7th floor of UAB Hospital with Patricia Marcus, who'd driven up from Mobile that same night, and Reverend Green came and sat with us for 2 hours, and by the next morning half the church knew, and the visitors started coming. The hospital visits became a kind of event. People would come by twos and threes in the afternoons after they got off work or after lunch, and Mama, even sick, would perk up the second she heard familiar voices in the hallway. She'd ask for her hair to be combed before visitors came. She'd worn her good robe, the blue one with the lace collar, not the hospital gown. Patricia worked from home doing medical billing for a dermatology practice, flexible hours, and she would come by UAB most afternoons around 2 after the morning crowd of doctors had finished rounds and before the evening crowd of family thinned out, which happened to be exactly when most of the church's visiting hours fell too. Sit with the mama, fix her hair, laugh with whoever came by, sign a little notebook the nurses kept at the desk so family could track who'd been in. Everybody saw Patricia, everybody. I was usually at the hospital too, but at different hours because I still had my job at the school district doing payroll 40 hours a week that I could not give up since somebody had to keep insurance on the family. I go before work 6:30 in the morning when the hallways were nearly empty, and I go again after work. After dinner, after I'd already cooked something for my own husband Ronnie and our daughter Keisha, who was still in high school then. By the time I got to UAB most evenings, it was past 7, and the visiting crowd had usually cleared out, and it would just be me and Mama and whatever machine was beeping that hour. So here is the first crack in the story, small enough that I don't blame anybody for not seeing it yet. Patricia was visible. I was present. Mama came home from that first hospitalization with a folder full of discharge instructions, and it was decided, mostly without anybody actually deciding it out loud, that she would live with me in the single-story house Ronnie and I had bought in Wylam, with the spare bedroom on the ground floor we retrofitted with grab bars and the shower seat the same week she moved in. Those are not the same thing, but to a room full of people who only see you for 20 minutes in the middle of the afternoon, they look exactly the same. And the visible thing is the thing people remember because it's the thing they actually witnessed. I want to tell you what those years actually look like, because the word caregiving doesn't carry the weight of it. 6:15 every morning, insulin before she fully woken up, because that's the only way to get an accurate reading. A shower every other day that took 45 minutes because of her balance. Laundry, because she had accidents some nights that she was deeply ashamed of and that we never discussed in front of anyone. Not Patricia, not Marcus, not Reverend Green, nobody. None of that happened where anyone could see it. The parts that looked like devotion from the outside, the hand holding, the hallway conversations, those are real, and Patricia's love for our mother was real too. But those parts are also structurally the easy 2%. The other 98% happens behind a closed door at an hour when church people are asleep, and it does not generate witnesses. More than once that first year, I fell asleep sitting straight up in the chair by her bed, jolted awake by my own neck, giving out certain the whole time that she'd been asleep right along with me. It wasn't until much later, piecing it together, that I understood how often her eyes had actually been open in those moments, watching me without a word, waiting until I drifted off again before she let herself do the same. It was around the second year that the church decided to honor her. Mount Olive holds a Women's Day program every spring, the way most Black Baptist churches in Birmingham do, a whole Sunday given over to celebrating the women of the congregation, with a guest speaker from a sister church and a special offering and a luncheon afterward in the fellowship hall. That year, the planning committee decided to add something new, a moment they were calling Crowns of Service, where they would recognize a handful of women in the church who were quietly carrying heavy loads at home. Sister Mavis told me about it after almost apologetically, the way you tell somebody about a surprise party they weren't invited to. The committee had asked around about who in the congregation was caring for a sick parent, and 3 names had come up independently from 3 different people, and all 3 times the name was Patricia's. I want to be exact about something here, and because it matters more than almost anything else I'm going to tell you. Reverend Green called her name during the program as she walked up looking genuinely confused, and he handed her a framed certificate with gold lettering in honor of faithful service to family, and the whole congregation stood up and applauded as somebody from the media ministry took photographs. The Kana would run in the church newsletter the following month under a small headline that said Mount Olive honors its quiet heroes. Patricia did not ask for this. She didn't even know it was coming until this Sunday it happened. I was sitting in the 11th pew on the right side where our family always sat, and I watched my sister's face while she held that certificate. And I want you to understand that what I saw there wasn't triumph. It was surprise, and underneath the surprise, something closer to discomfort, like a coat that had been put on her that didn't quite fit. For 1 second, maybe 2, I thought she might actually say something, turn to the microphone and say, "This should be my sister's. Ask somebody to bring me up there too." I have turned that 1 or 2 seconds over in my mind more times than I can tell you. She didn't say it. She smiled the way you smile when 300 people are looking at you and clapping. And she said thank you as she sat back down, and the certificate went up on her living room wall by that afternoon, where it still hangs. I never said a word about it. Not to Patricia, not to Ronnie, not to anyone. I drove Mama home that day, helped her out of the car, got her settled in her chair, and gave her 4 o'clock medication. And somewhere in the middle of counting out pills, I noticed my hands weren't quite steady. And I stood there at the kitchen counter for a minute, just breathing until they were. That was the first time I understood that this wasn't going to correct itself. I had thought in some vague way I'd never examined too closely that eventually people would simply see that the truth had its own gravity and would eventually pull everyone's attention toward it. Standing at that counter, I understood for the first time that the truth doesn't work that way at all. It just sits there quiet while the louder story keeps walking past it, getting introduced to more people, getting its photograph taken. The newsletter came out about a month later. The same monthly newsletter Sister Mavis had been mailing out of the church office since before I was grown, 200 addresses, because she said the older members deserved something they could hold in their hands instead of a screen. Patricia in her good dress, holding the certificate against her chest, and underneath it, in the same typeface that newsletter had used for 30 years without, as far as I knew, ever once printing something untrue. It said that Patricia Calhoun had cared for her mother faithfully throughout her illness. An example of the daughter's Mount Olive was proud to call its own. I got mine in the regular mail, same as everybody, and there on page 2 was a photograph from Women's Day. I stood in my own mailbox and read that twice. A thing people say out loud, I could let go of. People talk, and talk moves on. But this was typed and edited and printed and mailed to 200 houses in a neighborhood where most of them already half believed it anyway. And standing there with the mail still in my hand, I understood that whatever this had been before, it wasn't gossip anymore. It was the church's official record now. The kind that gets kept in a binder somewhere and pulled out 20 years later for some anniversary booklet, when somebody putting together the church's history would read that sentence and have no earthly reason in the world to doubt it. The following spring, Women's Day came around again, and this time the program committee did something different. Instead of just the certificates, they decided to give a few minutes of the luncheon over to a short personal testimony from one of the women being honored, something Reverend Green's wife had wanted to try for a few years, a chance for the congregation to hear in someone's own words what faithfulness actually felt like from the inside. The committee asked Patricia. Nobody asked me anything, but then nobody on that committee had any reason to think to. I want to be as fair to my sister in this part as I was at the start, because fairness is the only thing I have left to offer this story that I can be certain is true. Patricia didn't request that microphone. She told me herself the week before, a little nervous about it. The way you'd be nervous about anything you hadn't asked for and weren't sure you deserved. And I told her she'd do fine and meant it because at that point I still believed it without thinking twice. She stood up at the front of the fellowship hall in the green dress Mama had always liked on her, and she spoke for maybe 5 or 6 minutes, no notes, just talking, the way Patricia always could talk to a room without seeming to try. She said she loved her mother. She said the illness had taught her things about patience she didn't know she had in her. She talked about a particular Tuesday afternoon sitting with Mama on a back porch with glasses of sweet tea when Mama had told her some story from her own childhood in Bessemer that Patricia had never heard before, and how grateful she was for an illness that had, in its own strange way, given them that afternoon. She said family was the only thing that mattered in the end, that none of us know how much time we have left with the people who raised us, and that she thanked God every single day for the chance to give some of her time back to the woman who had given her all of hers. Every word of it was true. I want you to sit with that the way I had to sit with it in the third pew that morning, because it would have been easier if it hadn't been. If she lied, claimed nights she never spent, or mornings she never woke for, I could have felt something clean, something with a name on it. Instead, I felt something with no name at all, because there was nothing in it to argue with. She really had sat on that porch. She really had learned that patience. She just never once, in 5 or 6 minutes, about faithfulness and family and giving her time back to our mother, said my name. Not once. Not my sister and I. Not Lorraine handles the harder parts. Nothing. I don't believe she even noticed the absence while she was standing up there. The story she was telling was the only one she'd been given to tell, the one the church had been handing back to her, a little at a time, for 2 years now. And by then it fitted well enough that she'd stopped filling the scenes. When she sat down, the room stood up. Real applause, the kind that runs a beat longer than it needs to because nobody wants to be the one who stops first. People lined up afterward the way they had at the certificate, touching her arm, telling her she was an inspiration, asking for a photograph on their own phones, not just the one the media ministry was already taking. I heard Deacon Lummis tell somebody near me that Mount Olive ought to run that whole testimony in next month's newsletter, word for word, if Sister Mavis could get it down right, because the church needed to hear something like that more than once. I watched my sister receive all of it, and what stayed with me afterward wasn't the applause of the photographs. It was her face, the first time at the certificate. I told you what I saw there. Surprise, something close to discomfort, a coat that hadn't been broken in yet. This time there was none of that. She accepted every hand, every compliment, every request for a picture, with an ease that had nothing showy in it, nothing prideful, just comfortable. Like a woman standing in a room that had finally been built to her exact measurements. That was the thing that actually got to me that day, more than the missing name, more than the newsletter comment. Not that the story was wrong, that my sister had lived inside it long enough to stop noticing it was a room at all. I drove Mama home afterward, the two of us alone in the car, and she was unusually quiet the whole way, looking out her window at the houses going by, the same houses she'd been looking at her whole life. At a stoplight on 8th Avenue, I glanced over at her, and she was still looking out at nothing in particular. And after a long stretch of silence, she said without turning her head, "You always were the one who stayed after everybody left. That was all. No explanation, no follow-up, nothing, not at all." I thought in the moment that she drifted back to some old memory, a birthday party, a sleepover, one of 100 small things from 40 years ago her mind sometimes wandered into by then without warning. I said something like back to her, agreed with her, the way you agree with somebody you love when you're not entirely sure what they mean, and the light changed and we drove on, and I didn't think about it again for a long time. It would be almost 2 years before I understood she hadn't been talking of my childhood at all. The fall after that, there was a fish fry, a fundraiser the deacon board put on every October to help cover the church's heating bill for winter. 50 years running, the kind of event where half of Titus' bill shows up with foil pans to take plates home for relatives who couldn't make it. Patricia worked the serving line for 3 hours that Saturday, laughing with the men frying the catfish as somebody took a photograph of her standing behind the table in an apron that ended up on the church bulletin board with Patricia, faithful servant, written underneath in marker. I was at home that Saturday with Mama, who'd had a bad night and couldn't be left. And I want to tell you I didn't mind, because somebody had to be with her and it was simply logistically going to be me. But I sat in my own living room that evening eating a plate of fish Patricia had thoughtfully dropped off on her way home, looking at a photograph somebody had texted me of that bulletin board, and felt something small and quiet add itself to whatever had started at the kitchen counter that scream. Not a new wound, just the same one a little deeper. I haven't said much about Ronnie in all this, and that's its own kind of telling, because Ronnie absorbed more of those years than almost anyone. Quietly, the way he absorbs most things. He never once complained about the spare room being given over to a hospital bed, never complained about vacations we didn't take. Keisha, you're who was 14 when Mama moved in and 20 by the time she passed. Spent her whole adolescence in a house organized around somebody else's medical needs. And I know now, though she didn't say much at the time, that she resented it some. The way I disappeared down the hall mid-conversation if I heard a particular catch in Mama's breathing. I found out 2 years after the fact that Ronnie had made us a reservation downtown for our anniversary that third year, someplace nice with white tablecloths, and had quietly canceled it himself that same afternoon when Mama took a bad turn, never once mentioning there'd been a reservation at all, so I'd never have to feel the loss of something I didn't know I'd had. But I watched something go out of our marriage during those years. Not love exactly, love stayed, but a kind of ease we used to have. The ability to just sit on the porch in the evening and not be listening for anything. I only learned about it by accident, scrolling through an old email. We'd get Mama dressed for church, which by the third year was its own 40-minute production, and we'd drive to Mount Olive, and Patricia would meet us in the parking lot, having driven separately from her own house, as she would walk in on one side of Mama's wheelchair while I pushed it, and people would stream toward us in the vestibule, hugging Patricia first because she was nearest the door. What I didn't know until later still was that Mama had been sitting in her chair by the kitchen phone when he made that call, half dozing, and had heard the whole thing and never said one word about it to either of us. Sundays were their own kind of complicated because Sundays were also, on the surface, the best. Mama, that's sweet to leave. Tell them what you told me Tuesday, Patricia would say, and the table would erupt laughing, and I would mostly be in the kitchen, managing Mama's plate, cutting things small enough, calculating portions against whatever her sugar was doing that day, because you cannot do that kind of careful, constant math and also be present at the table telling charming stories. After service, we go to Sunday dinner, sometimes at Patricia's house, sometimes at mine, rotating around the same oak table that had belonged to our grandmother, scarred in one corner where Marcus had carved his initials at age 9. Patricia would tell stories from the week, funny things Mama had said. Gerald would talk about the Crimson Tide. Keisha had a piano recital that same year, her last one before she gave up the lessons altogether, and I missed it because Mama spiked a fever that afternoon and I couldn't risk leaving her. Keisha came by the house straight from the recital anyway, still in her good dress, to tell Mama how it had gone since I was in the back room with a thermometer and missed even that part of it. Weeks later, almost in passing, Mama mentioned that Keisha's face had fallen for just a second when she'd asked where I was, before she caught herself and smiled again for Mama's sake. Mama said it the way you mentioned what the weather had been that day. She didn't say anything else about it. She just let it sit there between us and moved on. By the time Mama got sick, it had grown into something closer to a small festival, 3 or 4 congregations setting up canopy tents within shouting distance of each other. A man from Inslee who'd been smoking ribs on the same drum grill for 20 years. Somebody's portable speaker playing whatever the choir director's grandkids wanted to hear. Children running barefoot through the grass between games of tide. An old man from Mount Olive and 2 or 3 sister churches finding each other under the shade trees the way they did every single year. Shaking hands like they hadn't seen each other since the last Juneteenth, even though half of them had sat 2 pews apart that very Sunday. We got there early because Mama wanted to be there for the whole thing. And getting her there early meant a folding chair set up under a particular oak tree Daddy used to favor, a cooler stocked with exactly the right drinks for her sugar, a wide-brimmed hat to keep the worst of the sun off her, and a clock I kept running in my head of how long she'd been sitting in direct heat versus shade, because by then her body didn't regulate temperature the way it used to, and a Birmingham June afternoon could turn dangerous for her faster than anybody but me seemed to fully understand. Year 4 brought a Juneteenth weekend the whole family had been looking forward to for months, the kind of celebration George Ward Park had been hosting for as long as I could remember, back to when Daddy used to load the trunk of his Buick with folding chairs and a cooler of red soda water and drive us over himself. So that's mostly what my day looked like. Moving her chair 6 feet to the left when the shade shifted with the sun, walking her slowly to the restroom trailer twice because heat plus her medication meant she needed to go more than she wanted to admit to anybody, including herself. Checking every hour or so whether she'd actually eaten more than a few bites of potato salad, because excitement in a crowd could make her forget her own hunger the same way it makes a child forget bedtime. Refilling her water before she asked for it, because by the time she asked, we were already behind. None of that takes long to describe, and none of it looked from a distance like very much at all. It looked like a daughter walking her mother to the bathroom. It looked like nothing. Patricia's day looked like something She moved through that whole gathering easy and bright, the way she always did, hugging Miss Ernestine's grown daughter, catching up with the cousin's wife she hadn't seen since the last reunion, laughing with a knot of church friends under the next tent over. She sat with Mama for long stretches between all of that, holding her hand while she talked to whoever drifted by, and she was the one who walked Mama over to greet Reverend Green and his wife when they arrived. The one who made sure Mama got introduced to a young pastor's family from Bessemer that nobody else had met yet. I wouldn't be clear because it matters that none of it was performance. Patricia loves our mother the same way I do. She simply got to love her in the part of the day that people gather around to watch. And people did gather all afternoon for pictures. Somebody was always calling out for one. Get one of Patricia and Miss Odessa before the light goes. Let's get a picture. Mama and Patricia, right there under the tree. Patricia, come stand by your mother. We need one for the church page. Cameras and phones came out steadily the whole day, the way they do at any gathering big enough to have its own collective memory. And Patricia obliged every time, laughing, arranging herself beside Mama's chair, holding up two fingers for the grandkids' sake. Nobody ever once called for a picture with me in it. Nobody left me out on purpose either. I was simply never standing still long enough to be caught in one. Every time a phone came up, I was already walking toward the cooler, or steering Mama back into the shade, or crouched down checking the color of her ankles for swelling. You cannot be in a photograph and out of the frame managing the thing the photograph doesn't know it needs, both at the same time. That night, worn through in the particular way only that kind of day can wear a person down. I sat on my own couch and scrolled through the pictures as they started going up, one church member after another posting their favorites. There were dozens by the time I stopped counting. Mama laughing under the oak tree, Patricia, mid-story, hand on Mama's shoulder, grandchildren in matching red, black, and green shirts somebody had ordered for the occasion, old church friends with their arms around each other, squinting into the sun. I went through every single one slower than I needed to, and I was not in a single photograph. Not one. Nobody had decided that. Nobody would have even noticed it if I hadn't sat there and noticed it myself. I didn't feel angry sitting there with my phone lit up in the dark living room. I felt something quieter and harder to name, something close to disappearing. I understood in a way I hadn't quite let myself understand before, that if somebody came along years from now and tried to piece together who would care for Odessa Pruitt using nothing but those photographs, every one of them would point to the same daughter, and they would not be lying. They would simply be looking at the only evidence anybody had bothered to collect. Nobody had cut me out of a single picture that day. I'd only spent the whole afternoon doing the kind of things a camera never thinks to turn toward. It was at one of Mama's birthdays, her 80th, that the second thing happened, and this one I felt in my body before I understood it in my mind. I was in the little kitchen off the back of the hall, the one with the pass-through window, drawing up Mama's evening insulin into a syringe on the counter because her schedule didn't pause for a party any more than it paused for anything else. And through the pass-through window, I could hear the front room clearly, the way you can hear a whole conversation through a thin wall without anybody knowing you're listening. We had rented the small hall behind the church for the party, the same room where I'd set up folding chairs as a 12-year-old for 50 cents a session, and half of Titusville came through that afternoon, plates of food on every surface, somebody's portable speaker playing Mama's old favorites low enough to talk over. My niece Deja, Patricia's daughter, 21 that year, and home from college for the weekend, was telling a small cluster of cousins how good Grandma was looking, all things considered. I mean, look at her, Deja said, and I could hear the genuine warmth in it. The kind of comment a young person makes because they love their grandmother and they're glad to see her laughing at a party. If she's doing this well after everything, it's because Aunt Patricia never leaves her side. I don't know how she does it. Nobody corrected her. Through the pass-through window, I could see them, 6 or 7 of them, nodding along, completely certain, completely kind, completely wrong. And not one of them turned their head 2 feet to the left, where they would have seen me standing in the doorway with a needle in my hand, doing the thing that was actually keeping our mother alive that afternoon. A cousin agreed, said something about Patricia being a saint. Somebody else said amen to it, lightly the way you say amen to something true and unremarkable, like saying the sky's blue. I stood at that counter with the syringe in my hand perfectly still for longer than it should have taken me to finish what I was doing. I want to slow down here because I've thought about this moment more than almost any other one I'm telling you about. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody was cruel. It was just 6 or 7 people I loved, agreeing with each other about something false, 2 feet and one thin wall away from the truth, and none of them even knew there was a wall there at all. I finished the injection. I went back out into the party. I hugged my mother and sang along to the last verse of Happy Birthday with everybody else. And if you had looked at my face in that moment, you would not have known a single thing had happened in that kitchen because I had gotten, by then, very good at that particular kind of face. It worked on everybody, that face. I believe for years it worked on her too. It wasn't until much later that I understood it never had. She simply decided somewhere along the way not to say so out loud. Maybe because saying it would have meant asking me to stop pretending, and stopping might have cost me whatever was left holding me up. Clear throat. She'd get agitated in the evenings, what the doctors called sundowning. And the only voice that could calm her down in those moments was mine, because I was the one there at that hour, learning by trial and 100 failed attempts exactly which songs she still remembered the words to, which old stories from her childhood in Bessemer would settle her breathing back down. Mama's mind started slipping the fifth year. Not dramatically, but in small, terrifying increments. She'd forget what day it was. She'd ask about Daddy as though he were just at the hardware store, 12 years after he died of a heart attack in this very kitchen, with me the one who found him. There was one night that fifth year I think about more than the others. She'd been agitated for almost an hour, certain there were strangers in the house, and I'd finally gotten her calm by humming something low, and just as she was drifting off, she took my hand, harder than I expected, and looked at me with a clarity that had been missing from her eyes for most of that evening. And she said, "You're so tired, baby." That was all. 3 words. I told her I was fine the way you tell a half-sleeping person, whatever will let them rest, and she closed her eyes, and I didn't think about it again for a long time, because there was always the next thing, the next hour, the next morning's insulin, and a person can only hold so many moments up to the light at once. Mama passed in March on a Tuesday. At home, in the bed I had moved into the front room 2 years earlier. I was the one with her. Patricia had been there earlier that evening, had sat with her for an hour and left around 8 saying, "Mama seemed peaceful," which she was, because peaceful is often what dying looks like from the outside when you only see 20 minutes of it. I was the one who heard her breathing change at 11:40, and I was the one holding her hand at 12:17 in the morning when she stopped. I called Patricia. She came back within 20 minutes, and we cried together in that front room. Sisters who had just lost their mother, and for those few hours, none of the rest of it mattered at all. The funeral was 4 days later at Mount Olive, and the Reverend Green preached a beautiful service, the sanctuary fuller than I've seen it since the church's own anniversary. Near the end, before the final hymn, the family was given a chance to speak, and Patricia stood up to give the tribute. Nobody had assigned her that role specifically. It had simply been assumed, the way certain things in our family had come to be assumed. I want to tell you honestly that what she said up there was not a lie. I have turned this over more times than almost anything else, and I have come to believe all the way down that Patricia believed every word she said that morning. She said, and I remember this exactly, "I made sure my mother never spent a single day without somebody who loved her close by her side." And she said it with her voice breaking, both hands pressed flat against her chest. And 300 people nodded back at her because it was true. Every word of it was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. And Patricia, light by then, no longer seemed to know there was a difference. She talked about sitting with Mama through the long afternoons. She talked about learning to comb her hair the way Mama liked it, gentle at the temples. She had heard this story about herself so many times from so many people she trusted for so many years that she had become, I think, a kind of faithful witness to her own legend. She wasn't performing. That's what made it so much harder to sit through than any lie could have been. A lie I could have been angry at. This was just my sister, grieving sincerely inside a story the whole community had built for her, one kind word at a time, brick by brick, until she was standing inside it the same as everybody else. I sat in the second pew with my hands folded in my lap, and I did not cry during that part, though I had cried plenty already that morning. I just watched her and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, something more like the particular loneliness of being the only person in a room who remembers an event differently than everyone else does, with no way to prove it and no desire in that moment to even try. At the repast afterward, in the fellowship hall, is where the story started, with Deacon Lummis holding my sister's hands and Sister Mavis and Miss Ernestine lining up behind him, and me standing off to the side with a plate going cold. I want you to understand that I wasn't angry at any of them in that line. They were loving the daughter they had actually seen. For 6 years in the daylight, I was the daughter they had mostly missed because I was never where the light was. It was 8 months later, the week of Thanksgiving, that the truth came out. And it didn't happen the way I expected, alone in a closet with a stack of notebooks. It happened in front of everybody at the same table where we'd eaten 1,000 Sunday dinners. We'd all come to my house that year, the whole family. Marcus down from Mobile with his wife. Patricia and Gerald and Deja, a handful of cousins. Miss Ernestine, who Mama had always insisted be included since she had no family of her own left in Birmingham. Deja, 22 now, had taken it upon herself to put together a small memory table near the dining room. Photographs of Mama through the years, and she'd gone looking in the hall closet for an old photo album she remembered from childhood. Instead, she found behind a box of church programs a stack of spiral notebooks, the same kind Sister Mavis used for the prayer chain. What are these? Deja asked, holding one up, and before I could even cross the room, she had already opened it the way young people do without thinking twice. And she read the first line out loud without meaning to start anything at all, just reading the way you read something interesting you stumbled on. Patricia visited this afternoon and brought peach cobbler. Lorraine stayed awake with me until almost 4. I wish they knew how much she carries. The room didn't go silent all at once. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet when one person stops talking and the people near them notice and lower their own voices to hear better. A kind of ripple. Deja, sensing she stumbled into something, turned the page half out of nerves now and read another line. Lorraine's hand shook this morning, giving me my shot. Didn't say nothing about it. Never does. Marcus, standing near the kitchen doorway with a plate in his hand, set the plate down on the counter without seeming to notice he'd done it. Patricia had been near the window, talking with Gerald, and I watched her turn at the sound of her own name in her mother's handwriting coming out of her daughter's mouth. She crossed the room and took the notebook gently from Deja's hands and kept reading herself, silently at first. And then, when she got to a passage near the middle, she read it out loud without anybody asking her to, her voice already unsteady. Patricia came again today, stayed 2 hours, made me laugh about the new nurse. I love seeing her face light up when she walks in. I don't think she knows how much lighter the house feels when Lorraine isn't carrying it alone for those 2 hours. I should tell her that. I keep meaning to tell both of them things I never say. Nobody moved for a moment. Miss Ernestine had her hand pressed to her chest. There was another notebook further back, and a cousin found it and handed it to Marcus, who read a line from a different year entirely, his voice catching on it. Miss Lorraine's anniversary again this year. Didn't even remember to ask Ronnie how it went. She never brings it up. I wonder how many things she stopped bringing up. It went on like that for almost 20 minutes, nobody performing it, nobody reading for effect, just people passing notebooks hand to hand around my own dining room table, finding entries at random, reading them out loud because the silence after each one demanded another voice to fill it. Gerald found one in the back of a different notebook and read it quietly, almost to himself, before realizing the table had already gone still enough to hear him anyway. Lorraine missed Keisha's award ceremony at school because I had a bad spell that afternoon. Didn't tell anybody she missed it. Found out from Ronnie by accident 2 weeks later. A cousin found another from what must have been the certificate year, dated only a few days after Women's Day. Saw the certificate go up on Patricia's wall today. Proud of her. Wanted to call somebody at that church and tell them they got it half right. Small things. A missed vacation. A 4 a.m. feeding mentioned in passing. My name again and again, not in grand declarations, just in the ordinary texture of my mother's days, the way a person's name appears in another person's private accounting of an ordinary Tuesday when they think no one else will ever read it. I found the last one myself near the bottom of the second notebook in handwriting so unsteady by then that I had to read it twice to be sure of it. There was no entry around it, nothing before or after on that page, just one line by itself, like she'd meant to write more and hadn't had the strength left in her hand. Found Lorraine asleep sitting straight up in the chair again tonight, 3 a.m, still holding my hand. Didn't wake her. I don't think she knows I see her like that. I don't think she knows I see her at all. I read it once silently and then, without quite deciding to, read it out loud to the table, my own voice doing something I hadn't planned for it to do. What I understood sitting at my own table while my family read my mother's handwriting back to each other was that she had seen everything, all of it. The shaking hands, the missed anniversaries. She had never said most of it to me directly, not in any of those years, not even in the night when she took my hand and called me tired. Not even that day at the stoplight on 8th Avenue when she looked out the window and told me I'd always been the one who stayed after everybody left. A sentence I'd let slide past me for 2 years as some half-remembered thing about my childhood, never once asking her what she actually meant by it. The exhaustion I thought I'd hidden so well behind that particular kind of face I practiced for years. She had meant exactly what she said. She had been writing it down faithfully, the way you keep a record of something you're afraid the world will forget. And she had clearly been afraid that I would go on after she was gone, carrying all of it with no one ever knowing it had happened at all. Patricia didn't say anything for a long time after the reading stopped. She sat down at the table in Mama's old chair at the end and looked at me across all that food, and what was on her face wasn't shame exactly, or not only shame. It was something more like grief, arriving late to a door it should have reached years ago. I let people believe it because it felt good to be believed in, she finally said to me in front of everyone, which she didn't have to do and which I think mattered more because she did. I never asked anybody to say those things about me, but I never corrected them either, and some part of me must have known what that silence was doing to you, and I let it happen anyway. Nobody clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment. Marcus came around the table and put his hand on my shoulder, and Miss Ernestine, who had known our family for 50 years, just shook her head slowly and said, mostly to herself, all this time, I'm not going to tell you the whole congregation suddenly sees me differently, because that isn't true, and this isn't that kind of story. The framed certificate still hangs on her living room wall. As she told me once, she thought about taking it down and decided against it because she said it isn't a lie that the church loved her. It's just not the whole story of who kept Mama alive. And she'd rather leave it up and tell the truth next to it than pretend the recognition never happened at all. Some people still ask after Patricia first when they see us together, out of 50 years of habit that doesn't undo itself in a season. But Patricia corrects them now, every single time, gently, and that correction has done more for me than any eulogy could have. The following June, at the family reunion at George Ward Park, the same park where Deacon Lummis had coached Little League for 30 years, Patricia stood up before the blessing unprompted and said that before we ate, she wanted to say one thing, that Lorraine had taken care of Mama every single day and night for 6 years, and that the family owed her something it had never properly given her, which was simply the truth, said out loud, where everybody could hear it. Nobody clapped that time either. A few of the older cousins nodded slowly, the way people do when some detail from years ago quietly slides into a different, truer place in their memory. Miss Ernestine, sitting in a folding chair under the same pavilion she'd sat under for 40 years of reunions, said, "You know, I always did wonder how you managed all that, working your job and everything. I just never thought to ask, that was all. No grand apology, just an old woman updating something she believed. I still have my mother's notebooks. I keep them in the same closet in the same front room where I still live, because Ronnie and I never moved even after. Some nights I take one out and read a page or two. Not the dramatic ones, just the ordinary entries. The weather that day, what Mama had for lunch, some small true thing she noticed about one of us that she never said out loud while she was alive to say it. I think that's the only kind of justice this story was ever going to get, and it doesn't feel like winning anything. It feels like relief. The particular relief of finally being seen by the people you love, even if it took your mother's handwriting, read aloud at your own dining room table to make it happen. If you take one thing from my mother's life and from mine, let me give you back what I promised you at the start. A hymn I told you I'd circle back to, one I didn't know I still remembered all the words to. It isn't the one about visiting the sick, the one the whole church already knows by heart, though we sing that one plenty over the years. It's a quieter one underneath it, the one nobody ever printed in a program. It isn't about the hand that waves the loudest. It's about the hand that stays under your back the whole way home, long after your eyes have closed, long after nobody else is looking. My mother knew the words to that one her whole life and never once sang it out loud. She wrote it down instead, a little at a time in the dark, and left it where I'd eventually find it. Some version of it has been running quietly through me ever since. The way a tune does when you've hummed it so long you stop noticing you're humming it at all.